Ilon Levy is one of the Israeli spokespeople who has graced our screens since Israel launched its latest bombardment of Gaza. Now, he can usually be found twisting the truth and feigning outrage at wholly legitimate questions. But one host on Sky achieved the impossible and, for a moment at least, made him seem like the most reasonable person on screen.
I was speaking to a hostage negotiator this morning. He made the comparison between the 50 hostages that Hamas has promised to release, as opposed to the 150 prisoners that are Palestinians that Israel has said that it will release. And he made the comparison between the numbers and the fact that does Israel not think that Palestinian lives are valued as highly as Israeli lives?
That is an astonishing accusation. If we could release one prisoner for every one hostage, we would obviously do that. We're operating in horrific circumstances. We're not choosing to release these prisoners who have blood on their hands. We are talking about people who have been convicted of stabbing and shooting attacks. Notice the question of proportionality doesn't interest Palestinian supporters when they are able to get more of their prisoners out. But really, it is outrageous to suggest that the fact that we are willing to release prisoners who are convicted of terrorism offenses, more of them than we are getting our own innocent children back, somehow suggests that we don't care about Palestinian lives. Really, that's a disgusting accusation.
Now, as I say, often when he sort of does these outraged answers, it's because someone else asked him a completely legitimate question. Like, can we see evidence, that XYZ happened? And they say, are you disbelieving the IDF? Are you disbelieving us? That's the kind of answer he's often giving to perfectly reasonable questions. That was not a reasonable question. That was completely bizarre. It made absolutely no sense. I do not know what she was thinking. We shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves, though. Because though Burley's question was bad, Levy's answer was pretty bad too. Now, he said, we are releasing these prisoners who have blood on their hands. And then he described prisoners who are convicted of terrorism offenses. Now, that makes it sound like Israel are releasing some pretty dangerous people. This is the reality, though, and it's from the not very radical outlet CNN. So they write, the list of Palestinian prisoners eligible for release includes the ages of the prisoners and the charges on which they are being held. Throwing stones and harming regional security are among the most common. Others are listed as detained for supporting illegal terror organizations, illegal weapons charges, incitement, and at least 2 accusations of attempted murder. Some of the people are listed as being members of Hamas and other Islamic militant groups, but many of the prisoners are not listed as belonging to any organization. Most of the Palestinian prisoners listed as eligible for release are male teenagers aged 16 to 18, children under the United Nations definition, although a handful are as young as 14. Some 33 are women, according to a CNN count. Accusations of attempted murder are, of course, very serious, and CNN says there are 2 of those. But it sounds as if a lot of the Palestinians set to be released are teenagers guilty of throwing stones. Right, so these aren't incredibly dangerous terrorists or criminals. And that's not surprising. This is from a report from Save the Children on abuse in the Israeli prison system. It was released earlier this year. Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system face physical and emotional abuse, with 4 out of 5 of them being beaten and 69% strip-searched, according to new research by Save the Children. Nearly half are injured at the point of arrest, including gunshot wounds and broken bones. Some report violence of a sexual nature, and some are transferred to court or between detention centres in small cages, the Child's Rights Organisation said. This is a press release from them. Save the Children and a partner organisation consulted 228 former child detainees from across the West Bank, detained from between 1 and 18 months, and found that most children are beaten, handcuffed and blindfolded during arrest. They are also interrogated at unknown locations without the presence of a caregiver and are often deprived of food, water and sleep or access to legal counsel, according to the research. The main alleged crime for these detentions is stone throwing, which can carry a 20-year sentence in prison for Palestinian children. Right? So you've got loads and loads of teenagers in prison suffering horrendous abuse, as reported by Save the Children, the majority of them for throwing stones, which can carry a 20-year sentence for throwing stones at an occupying army. Israel has been subject to criticism for the number of Palestinians it arrests and imprisons under what is called administrative detention. Now, that can last for months or years without a detainee being told why they are being detained. So this is completely, extrajudicial. And this has only got worse since October the 7th. Now, Vox reports this. Before October 7th, the number of Palestinians held by Israel under administrative detention was already at a 20-year high. According to the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, there were 1,310 Palestinians imprisoned without charge or trial at the end of September, including at least 146 minors. Since then, Israel has dramatically increased its use of administrative detention, pushing the number of detainees to over 2,000 within the first 4 weeks of the war. That's out of a total of roughly 7,000 Palestinian prisoners. And Vox quote a director at Amnesty International who says this: Amnesty has found that Israel's systematic use of administrative detention against Palestinians indicates that it's used to persecute Palestinians rather than as an extraordinary and selectively used preventative measure. Evidence has shown that administrative detention is a pretext to persecute and deprive people of their fundamental rights and freedoms because they challenge the Israeli military occupation. Now, Ash, I think this is important because the way this is reported and the way the sort of Israeli spokespeople talk about it is as if, Hamas are releasing innocent hostages. And obviously Hamas are releasing innocent hostages. The people who were taken hostage on October the 7th are entirely innocent. They were not guilty of anything. But the suggestion is that the release of prisoners by Israel is completely different, because these are criminals. These are terrorists. When in fact, we don't know that much about them. And we do know that Israel does detain lots of people without charge, without telling the people why they are detained. And even if they do tell the people why they are detained, it might be for something as simple as throwing stones. So this isn't, it's somewhat misleading to sort of talk about this as an exchange of hostages for prisoners, even if, on one level that is, literally true. I do think it is somewhat misleading because, the prisoners that Israel have are not that dissimilar from hostages.
So I think this is a really, really important point to make, which is that Israel gets the benefit and the legitimacy of being a state. And statehood, of course, is something which is denied to the Palestinians. So it means that when we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about the targeting of civilians, the failure to distinguish between military and civilian targets. That is a brush that Hamas gets tarred with. But even though the IDF does all of those things and does them at a far greater scale, they get the benefit of being an army and not a terrorist group because Hamas is a non-state actor and the IDF is, of course, the army of a nation state. When we look at hostage taking, now, this is in no way a defense of Hamas hostage taking, just before someone thinks to clip something and put it out of context. Hamas takes hostages by conducting a military raid on Israeli soil. Israel takes hostages by setting up a legal system and calling captivity administrative detention. Now, what this means is that you can be detained without evidence, without charge, without trial, for really as long as the Israeli state wants to hold you on the flimsiest of pretexts, and you have no real recourse to justice. And because the Palestinians don't have a state, they can't do that in return. And because the Israelis do, their hostages get called prisoners, and it's dressed up with all the niceties of the legal system. And there is a total a total inequality of how the use of force, the use of state violence can be applied. Because if a Palestinian is accused of violence against an Israeli, they're subject to the Israeli legal system. If an Israeli settler commits a crime in Palestinian territory, in an illegal settlement against any Palestinian, they can't be arrested and tried by the Palestinian Authority. They have to be indicted by the Israeli state. So that shows you that you've got this total monopoly on legitimate violence, so-called, by the Israeli state. And it means that the things that they do, which are by magnitudes at a greater scale than anything that Hamas is able to do, it gets cleaned off. It doesn't get tarred with the brush of terrorism, but it's also not held to the same standards that, other westward-facing so-called liberal democracies would be held to either. They get to have their cake and eat it too. We discussed the use of human shields on yesterday's show, Michael, which is something which Hamas have been accused of because they operate in densely populated civilian areas. Now, there have been dozens of recorded cases of the IDF using Palestinian civilians as human shields, of Israeli police using Palestinian civilians as literal human shields, even after the practice was supposedly banned by an Israeli court ruling in 2005. And yet, when we're discussing Israel and Palestine in the British media, it's Hamas that use human shields. What Israel do is completely unmentioned. And I think that this is part of the intellectual violence of occupation, which is if you're the side with the army, you'll have the upper hand and you'll be treated as a legitimate force in much of the world's media, particularly if you're a state that's allied with particular countries. Whereas if you're a non-state actor, precisely because you've been denied a state, anything you do will be framed as criminality at best or some kind of inherent blood deep evil that you're born with, at worst, which is what I think the discussion of Hamas has tipped into. It's this idea of it's an age-old hatred rather than it's a political force which has emerged because of Israeli policy over the decades.
We've talked about the serious substantive point in that clip. Can I also just ask you about Kay Burley's question? What was she thinking?
I think it's very generous of you to presume she was thinking it all. I mean, I think that she thought she was doing a sort of like mathematics gotcha, but it really made no sense. And I think there was this moment where the guy she was interviewing was puzzled and then sort of recovered and then said all the things that he'd normally say about how dare you, this is a ridiculous accusation. But of all the ways in which you can illustrate that Israel clearly does value Israeli lives far beyond and above Palestinian lives, the idea that they've negotiated a release of fewer Israeli hostages than Palestinian prisoners, in my view, hostages, that's not how you do it. That's it doesn't illustrate that point at all.